So, Angelos, it's really great to have you here today. It's been a long time since we first connected virtually, actually. And I remember reaching out to you several times, inviting you to join some of the startup opportunities our community at Startup Links was offering. You have come a long way since then. I know you were shortlisted and selected for a couple of programs, not just with us, but with other equally amazing ecosystem builders in this space as well. I'm very glad that we have had a chance to support a part of your growth journey. I'm even more excited that we get to share your story with our community today.
Thank you very much for having me here and also for the great support that you provide to startups. I have been actually actively following your programs and your recommendations, and they've always been very, very useful. So I'm really, really grateful for that support, also for the space today to talk about Infrared.city. Yeah, thank you.
Great to hear that. Yes, you have taken a very interesting path from academic research to founding Infrared.city. So if you had to explain in one or two sentences, what does Infrared.city do? What would you say?
Yeah, I think the primary sort of like thing that we're trying to do is change the way we design cities and buildings so that we make them more sustainable. What we're doing is removing the burden and the barriers of climate assessments and climate simulations by using AI. So what would normally take you experts, very complicated simulations, long time assessments and calculations we do in seconds, and within a few minutes you can have a full assessment of your building or your sort of like urban area on what the climate will do to it, will how the climate will affect it. And I think that that's sort of like what we're trying to do, removing the barriers of simulation.
That sounds a very compelling vision, right? A lot of improvement compared to the status quo, saving time and making this simulation previously only available in the lab, now accessible to, the mass in this community, like architects and planners. So I know that Infrared.city started as a research project, right? I wonder at what point did you realize it had the potential to become a full-fledged business?
Infrared.city is the outcome of years of research, personal and from my co-founders, that accumulated in a moment where a little bit before the AI boom that we see today, we managed to actually really shift a bit of ground on simulations. We managed to do something that would normally take a week in a second, and we started talking about it. And when we started talking about it openly, people wanted to use it. They were very excited. People asked to sort of like use it in their own practices. We made an MVP. We even tried to sell some licenses from within the Austrian Institute of Technology, the AIT, which was the parent organization, but very quickly realized that we couldn't scale, we couldn't grow very fast within a research institute as a software company. And with the support of the institute, we were able to spin off. And I think the moment we realized was when we had a lot of people wanting to use a tool rather than make a project with us. And therefore we said, why don't we focus on making that tool massively available? And that was the decision. I have to say it's more impact driven, like the personal decision to move out of a research position and do this rather than money driven. But yeah, it's still for a startup to grow, you still need to reach enough people. So the transition from a research mindset to entrepreneurial mindset was what was the most challenging part. I always love to be in between the spaces. You can't really know what to research if you don't know how it can be applied, and you can't really apply research if you don't know how to do it, right? So like I always love being in between research and practice. I've always done so, and even before when I was doing a PhD, etc., there was like a practice-based PhD, and I think that for me, knowing, understanding how something can be useful, can be moving a whole community is equally important into sort of like formulating research questions and understanding the state of the art.
Wonderful. Okay, compared to a research project, what would you say was the hardest part about building a business? Is it fundraising? Is it figuring out business model or something entirely different?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I, first of all, I don't have like formal business training. So definitely understanding the business part is important. It's not really the economics. Economics are relatively simple in terms of math, and it's the uncertainty. It's the sort of like you're having to move into a world where you have no given facts necessarily, or not specific formulas. You have to always juggle expectations and visions, and at the same time reality of the market, and understanding essentially how something fits into something. I think that I love learning. For me, it was like really great to go into a new space. I think definitely the most difficult was fundraising. We had to raise a pre-seed round in the middle of 2023, which was definitely not a great year in terms of fundraising. A lot of things were happening, wars, economic crisis, all, it was a perfect storm, but we actually managed to do that, which was really, really great, because we had a project where I think has a lot of merit, and at that point it was seen by our strategic investors, our first investors. So yeah, I think fundraising was definitely the most difficult part. At the same time, since we're operating in the architecture and construction business, which is very uncertain, crafting a business model that made sense was also very difficult, because, again, it's a very uncertain field, a very uncertain industry, and not easily moving. So both business models and fundraising were the more tricky parts, I'd say. Yeah.
Yeah, congratulations, first of all, on the success on the fundraising part. During that process, would you say, was it easier to attract the public money or private money? Have you tried both routes?
Since we are in Austria, public money is relatively easier than private money, right? So like there are, and that's one of the reasons I love being here and setting up a company. There's like a lot of support from the state and from national institutions, especially for research, and especially for research that is done for bettering the world. On the other hand, we actually focused on private money more than public money in the beginning. So actually, we didn't get any grants in the first year of the project. We just got grants now in the second year. I think the reason was we were already coming from a research institute, and we were already like kind of like supported by public money. We wanted to really see that there is potential for this business from the private side, and I think that was a really good sign for us. Raising a 1 million pre-seed round was actually a really good sign that there is interest for this space and for our solution. And I think then we went on to leverage some of the public money.
From your perspective, what would you say are the pros and cons from these two approach of raising money? Because in our community, lots of founders are constantly evaluating which route should they take. Should they go for more the grant side, or should they go for more the equity taking side? Because we know that both sides have their pros and cons, right?
I'm not like a serial entrepreneur, so I can actually give like really solid advice there. But from my very limited experience, like with founders, it's a very personal thing. Like different founders have different aspirations of what they're doing. I don't particularly care about holding or maximizing the equity that I hold in a company. I care more about that company actually growing, scaling up, and getting this solution to the hands of a lot of people, because I think, as I said, impact drives me. So seeing people using Infrared.city to make actually cities more sustainable is more important to me than holding more equity. But that's personal, and everybody else has different opinions. My suggestion is that at every sort of like stage of your growth, you need different things. And you always have to have a balance. I mean, like for example, in Australia, there's like a lot of public money, but a lot of companies kind of like base themselves too much on the public money in the beginning. And then when the investors are seeing that, they're thinking, you need a lot of grants to be able to reach where you're here? Do we have any
Mm.
signs that you can actually sell, that you can actually, help make this sort of like a viable economic venture? So for me, you have to prove yourself in both sides. I would take the grants to grow the research side for sure, but I would definitely rely on the private money early as possible to make sure that there is a route, at least a proof of interest from private investment. And I am very much a sort of like a sort of fan of state funded R&D, especially when it's for good.
I also feel like on the private investor side, you have more need to emphasize on your economic viability, right? For example, if you already have revenue, even unpaid traction, it's easier to attract the private equity. But from the public side, probably they don't care too much about whether you are pre-revenue or already have revenue. Is that intuition kind of makes sense?
There's different grants and different sort of like types of funding. For example, in Austria, we have like both funding for startups and funding for research. Funding for research actually cares about you advancing research rather than any traction of that. Like it's more sort of like, are you really changing the Austrian research regime? The funding, even the state funding that relates to startups, also needs to see traction and judges you as a sort of a startup, which I also think that is very useful. Of course, VCs, angel investors, etc., like private money is more caring about sort of like you making economically viable, increasing their investment. So I think that you need to prove yourself in, especially if you're an R&D startup or heavy R&D startup like us, you need to prove yourself in all the different domains, right? I do need to prove myself on the R&D side because what we're doing is really heavy deep tech R&D, but we also need to do that, make sure that this is actually something that's applicable to the market. And one of the things that we academic founders make a mistake always about is we're trying to do things too perfectly, perhaps, or we're very sort of like invested in the research side sometimes. You need to go out and make sure that you can sell as well, and that's probably the most difficult part as a mindset, to really figure out that okay, you might have seen a R&D space that's really really interesting, and you think that it's going to break something, some new ground, but you have to also go to the market's need. Does it need it right now, or are you doing it for the future, which is also possible.
There has to be customers who actually want it and willing to pay for it, right? No matter how advanced the technologies are. Speaking of traction, where does like Infrared.city stand now in terms of traction? Do you already have any paid customers or pilots, programs, etc.?
We do have paid pilots. We've focused in the first version post our spin-off of our product earlier this year, and we've only focused up to now on making this available, sort of a top tier architecture and planning companies. That's where like we've been focusing mostly on, and we have traction. We have like a lot of users that have actively been using Infrared.city, paid users, and also paid pilots with cities and relatively big cities in Europe. We're still very much in the discovery phase, like we're still finding our space, but we do have some good signs that this is useful. And now we're raising a seed round, and our focus is now, since we've seen that we have a product that is actually now fine-tuned a bit and also useful to some people, it's about scaling. It's about making sure that we can actually access a lot of people. So now we're going into sort of like more growth phase of expanding our user base, giving the sort of like software to the masses, let's say, and see how that goes. Yeah.
Who are your targeted customers? Are they government agencies, for example, city planner from the public agencies, or more like a private architect studio, for example?
They can be a wide range of people and businesses mainly. They can be both cities and governments, and we actually have cities that are working with us to implement Infrared.city in their planning. We're working very closely with the city of Hamburg, which is has already implemented parts of our solution in their connected urban digital twins. We are also working with planners, with architects and planners, and we're also working with private consultants that are like sometimes helping planners or helping cities. We're also teaching Infrared.city at universities, so we're using it. Academic institutions also use Infrared.city for their simulation needs. We are offering our solution both as a sort of like architecture and planning product where we have a web app and plugins and GIS and BIM and CAD plugins, but we also have an API access to our product, which allows a lot of people to use it in different ways. If you care about how the urban environment will affect essentially and be affected by the climate, you can use that for a lot of other things, like for example, figuring out vegetation in the city, but also figuring out infrastructural stress on the city, etc. So it can be a lot of different things.
As a startup, how do you normally acquire your customers? What's your go-to market strategy?
Yeah, so currently we've mostly focused on founding-led sales. So we haven't done ads and big marketing campaigns. We're starting to touch upon this space now, but it's been more sort of like handcrafted up to now. Like it's more us going to people that we know. We are very lucky to have a big network that kind of like is around us, a community that follows us and cares about what we're doing. So through events and through sort of like brokerage events, found people that are interested in using our platform. That's our current strategy. But of course, as I said, we're now growing, so we're now sort of like also going to be putting in ads and more sort of like marketing campaigns, etc.
So you focus right now more on the organic growth side and rely a lot on personal network, in-person interactions first.
Yeah, up to now it's been mostly organic. Yeah.
Okay, how about market? Apart from Austria, what are the other markets are on your focus list right now, where you want to go first?
Yeah, I have to admit that we haven't gotten any clients on Austria. So like we're an international solution, and most of our clients are international. Collaborations in Germany, we have collaborations in Italy and Spain. We also have collaborations in Japan, which we recently started working with. So Asia, Middle East, and Europe, US, Australia, like it's pretty much everywhere, and of course Africa. So yeah, it's not, we don't have any sort of like restrictions, let's say, like in terms of like geographic restrictions, but we definitely have to have essentially people that are interested in bringing climate in the design space.
Interestingly, you mentioned a concept before called climate-aware design. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
I give people normally the simplest example, right? Like, because we're talking about climate change, and most people are talking about climate change as if it's something external to them, or it's something that they can help because they're good people to alleviate, but it's not really, and people think about their cars, about how many flights they take, and you know that the most important greenhouse emission contribution is coming from buildings. 40% of emissions come from buildings and their operations. And the way we are building buildings and we're building our cities is the most important factor of how we're gonna essentially adapt to the new climate. And I say to people the simplest sort of like question, right? Like you're renting a house or you're buying a house, you have like you're gonna choose where you're gonna live, right? Essentially. And you're looking at how many square meters it has. Does it have like a nice sort of like layout where my living room will be, where my furniture will be? Do you ever know how the climate will be in that building, in that specific? Do you ever do sort of like a daylight analysis to figure out how much daylight will you get? And more importantly, like a thermal comfort analysis to see if your penthouse in, I don't know, Austria or your sort of like condo in the States will be unbearable to live in 20 years. If I could give you a tool that like you could shift to 2050 and see how how good that living condition would be, would you not care? So when we say climate aware design, we mean understanding how climate affects a building, its surroundings and its interior, and how it affects people, right? So like how will it behave within a certain climate condition? And if today the climate condition is is X, what will it be in 20, 30 years? So let's say there's a new development in China where you're right now, right? And then no greenery is put on the ground, no care is put on how the wind will affect the tall buildings and how it will go around, or there's no sort of like essentially care for the materials, etc. In 15, 20 years, that place might be very, very difficult to live and sell as a property as well. So when we talk about climate aware design, we're talking
Mm.
about being aware of the climate effect at the decision, at the design decisions when you're making them.
So are you saying many buildings we are living in right now, they might become unlivable 20 or 30 years down the road if they are not aware of what to do right now?
I'm actually not saying that. I think that I'm saying this is a fact now. It's not in 20, 30 years. There was an
Mm.
article recently on The Guardian that there are unsellable like properties in London today, not in 20 years, that people will not buy because they're like extremely hot in the summer. As you go into a heat and sort of like increased heat climate, a lot of the buildings will need a lot of infrastructure to be able to be livable,
Mm.
and a lot of them will probably also be unlivable. And there are many sort of like studies around this. How many people will be displaced? Billions is what the United Nations, for example, say. So it really matters to all of us. And I think that when we're saying climate aware design, we mean at least being able to see the effect when you're making a decision, like when you're designing whether you're going to put some trees here or not.
But I'm thinking when developer, they started to develop a project, a lot of factors are out of their control, right? For example, they only have the control over the piece of land they bought. But in the neighborhoods, how the trees, greenland, how the greeneries are shaping, or how the wind are coming, this is something out of their control. So even if they have the simulation, what can they do? What can they do about it? Unless who make the ultimate decision is at the city level, I mean, at a higher level where the orchestration is done by the higher level of decision makers.
It's a very interesting discussion because it's actually both, like it's all the three sides that matter. A city is looking at its stock, its building stock, and its greenery and its issues, and it says, you know, it implements policy, right? Like policy is essentially you can't put like tall buildings here because they're going to create a really big wind regime, etc., and they will affect the city around it. So the city needs our solution because they also need to be able to figure out where to put the tall buildings. I was just talking to the city of Zurich the other day, and they're like considering exactly that, where they can densify, they can put taller buildings, and how will that affect the wind in other parts of the city. So the city implements policy, but the developers and the planners and the architects are actually adapting to the policy, but they can do better than the policy. They don't necessarily have to do only what the policy says. So if I want to put more greenery in my site, and developers actually have a huge impact on how a city looks, sometimes way more than the city, I can still make my situation better than it would be if I choose in my own plan to make things better. And then the other side, which is the owners, the users, the dwellers, essentially the people who live in these flats and these buildings, they also choose the right building according to what they feel would be better for their lives. If we could offer to all of them the ability to know the impact, this will change the whole value chain. It would actually change the value of property and land. It would change how you value a piece of land, or how do you value an apartment or a building, and when you're buying, when you're using it, and that would affect what the developers would sell to you, and they would actually be also interested to understand the impact and make sure that they sell you something that is more interesting for you. And it also affects essentially the policymakers, the cities, which are sort of like changing the way you can build, right? Like just putting in the regulations, and they can eventually, hopefully, say if you're gonna put like 100,000 square meters of built mass in a city, you also have to put 1,000 trees, because we're going to put a rule that says 1 tree per 1,000 square meters or whatever. Like, so it's something that the city can do. Lots of them will do eventually, and we'll start also to offload this need for greenification and for sort of like more climate aware design to the developers.
If it takes three parties sitting together from the city policymaker side, from developer planner side, and from the user, the resident side, if it takes three parties to sit together and make an impact to a certain area, then do you worry about your sales cycle? For example, it will probably take a longer sales cycle for you to make an impact to certain regions, certain area where you want to make a difference in terms of the climate impact, right?
Not necessarily, because we're not right now sort of like focusing on selling to all of the different stakeholders of this process. For now, we're like mainly focusing on architects, planners, and the cities, right? We're not going into the sort of like user yet. But I think that this is something that will organically happen as we grow, not only us as a company, but like as climate crisis continues to bring the challenges to the cities. Today it's already like very, very prominent. Everybody is looking for solutions for at least the risk factors, so like, floods and wildfires. I mean, we see them everywhere and they're like really devastating. I come from Greece like 2 years ago, 23, when I was actually spinning off. It was kind of a tragic irony. Like we lost, I think it was 5% of our GDP in a week on floods. So it's something that affects a lot of people, and cities are definitely looking at it. So I think on the side of like planning, development, and sort of like adaptation, we are already seeing the need. So that's where we're primarily sort of like focusing to sell. And I think that the people, the public, the general public, will also come in this sort of like game of resilience, because as we see again the effects of climate change coming in, people will actually need to know, they will require more certainty. We can also make that possible with more awareness of what does it mean to buy a house in X or Y location. So I think the sort of like side of the B2C side, let's say, will happen later on. The B2B side is easier to happen now because a lot of people are already doing this.
Thanks for sharing that. Coming back to a point you mentioned earlier, you said building probably is one of the biggest contributor to climate change, right? Could you elaborate on that a little bit more from the scientific point of view? Because often we believe like transport or industrial production are the biggest contributor. They produce a lot of pollution, the global warming, for example. But you are saying building is actually a very big factor. So is it during the process when we like build the building, or is it the process when we use it? For example, the AC we are using, once the residents get in, they are using on daily usage.
So this is a very, very interesting discussion. We actually have a podcast as well in Infrared.city, where we're talking about different things. And there is one particular one that I've invited to prominent researchers, colleagues of mine, and professors, to talk about embodied versus operational. That's what we call the two different. So when we're talking about carbon footprint of a building, there is in its life cycle essentially two parts, right? One is the materials, the building, the construction, essentially all of the energy that's needed on the carbon footprint that relates to building the building, right? So like concrete is a very intense, carbon intense material. So to make, 1 cubic meter of concrete, you need X, carbon tons. So if you imagine that in a whole building, it's still even more sort of like carbon intense. So the materials is one thing, construction itself is another thing. In the whole sort of like cycle up until you make the building, you put it up and it's standing, and also its maintenance perhaps for material side is the embodied carbon. And of course, when you renovate it, right, like new materials, glass also very intense material. So that's the embodied part. And then there's the operational part, which is like, as you say, I'm turning on the air conditioning, the electricity, like I'm living in this building, so I'm consuming energy. So the combination of those, specifically the buildings, right, are 40% of the greenhouse emissions in the world today. That's essentially, there's plenty of studies around that. Of course, that includes probably sort of like industrial buildings, but not the industrial processes, right? So there's a different thing. There is a shift between the embodied and the operational that's happening. I don't know exactly where it stands. That was a debate about whether embodied or operational is more important today. So whichever it is, the operational is a huge part. So what you're saying, the air conditioning, the heating, and the very, very interesting thing is if I want to move from point A to point B, I need an amount of energy. If I want to move a car from point A to point B, the amount of energy that I need is given. I can make it through electrical power, I can make it through other power, but like I have to push that car from here to there, and there's an amount of energy that's needed. If I put a house in a climate, I can sort of like react to that climate in many different ways, which means that if I have enough windows in enough good locations to when the summer kicks in, open the windows and let the air flow and ventilate the building, actually I might need a lot less air conditioning. And it's incredible for me to see. I was in a conference in Florida like a few years ago where we were like discussing this idea of how do we make natural ventilation possible, etc. And we were in a fully air conditioned space that was like 18 degrees, where outside was a very good 24 comfortable temperature. And I'm like, sometimes we're missing the point that a building could be operating with much less energy than it needs today if it was designed better. And nature is also a very important aspect in that. So that's when we're talking about, making like climate aware design is essentially, are you even taking advantage of putting a window to the sea and you don't really care what that window will bring to your building? And that's I think the very tricky part, that cars have we put a lot of effort in making cars more sustainable. We've put a lot less effort in making buildings more sustainable. They're more important than cars.
Coming back to the startup life, you also mentioned something before called uncertainty, right? You said compared to the lab research, startups life involves a lot of uncertainty. So I want to know, how do you nowadays cope with that uncertainty? Are you start to embrace it, enjoying it? How are you coping it?
I think that uncertainty for me is definitely a problem because I do come from more sort of like a scientific background, and I need to know, like, how exactly things are going to be done in the next 18 months, which is absolutely impossible for a startup. So therefore, I'm coping with that by embracing it and by learning to operate in a, sort of like more jungle environment where you get to get the signals every week, every month, and try to adapt. It's not very easy. It's something that I had to shift my mindset, and I love shifting my mindset. So I think that that's giving me a lot of sort of like essentially power to do it, like sort of courage to do it. And I think that the other way is, of course, we have a really nice team of founders and also a very nice team, and it's essentially helping each other understand, because we're all coming from more scientific backgrounds or sort of like design backgrounds. It's helping each other, supporting each other, like understand that the uncertainty will have to be there in the beginning, and there will be moments. Like everybody was saying, it's a roller coaster, and it's kind of like a roller coaster, but it's a very different roller coaster when you have good company. So I think that like the fact that I have my founders as my good company, and they're all like we're four people, and they're like all different people and bring very different qualities, is what helps me cope with this uncertainty, because it really is it's a very different let's say mindset for each one of us. And I think that's where we're bringing sort of like the diversity of approaches to uncertainty. And I think that helps me, that calms me down when I see the other people's reaction. And also, of course, I use a lot of tools to help me plan, right? And of course, plans are always plans, but I use a lot of I'm trying to plan things. Yeah.
We often say a company is only as strong, as good as its team, right? Very luckily, you had a good team. I wonder, where did you get them? So where did your co-founder come from? And what was your relationship like? And where did you get the other team members?
Yeah. So I have to say, like, for me, that is probably the best part of having a startup. Like, we really have a very nice environment around us, and we really sort of like I feel we're like really fitting together as a team. I didn't find them. Like essentially, it's not exactly how it was. Like we found each other together, and we together found Infrared.city. So with all of them, I've been working for years before we start a company, and we're in the same space, and we have a community around us. So we've been working on the same sort of like topics for some time. We collaborated in the past. With some of them I'm teaching, with some of them I'm sort of like, I'm still teaching, have been teaching before, and with some of them I'm like was developing solutions. So we were all together like kind of like working as a team before we spin off. And I think the rest of the team, so like how we grew sort of like we're now 15 people, they're also coming from this space. So most of the hires we have, etc., are coming from our general like community, and we're very happy that that happens because it's this organic reach. There's a lot of people that trust our vision, believe in what we're doing, and I think that that's the most rewarding part.
Do you have any advice about team building and hiring for future founders?
Probably the most interesting part of entrepreneurship is trying to build a company differently, trying to build a team that works differently, and we're trying that. And of course, we're gonna fail, and we're gonna try again, and others will fail and try again. Like that's the process. But for me, it's changing essentially also how we see employment and work and sort of like relationships with our colleagues and our sort of supervisors, which I hate as a sort of like as an idea. Learning to work differently in the sense of allowing decisions to happen with others involved. It's more about sort of like inclusive workplaces, less authoritarian and less sort of like top down. So having the people of a team feel that they're all part of the decisions. There's a lot of transparency in what we're doing. We're openly talking, and I think that cultural part is the most important. And I think when we're just talking about like finding founders, or so like advising founders on how to get their own co-founders, I'd say you have to stop looking at the skills and the CV and oh, this guy has like raised 20 million before, great, I should get him to raise money for my companies. But it's like not going to be like this. You're gonna be spending a very long time with these people, and you're gonna be deep in trouble with these people. So you can only do that with trust. It's like I send you to an island with two other people and I tell you you have to survive. You wouldn't choose them only. You would want them to know how to, I don't know, like make a fire or sort of like catch food. But you also want them to, share that food with you, because if they don't, you're in trouble. So this is it's a marriage. It's not just it's not just something that you go to work together and you like say goodbye afterwards. It's a lot of entanglement, and you have to cope with everybody else's difficulties as a person, right? Like I might be very, sometimes I might get like bursts of anxiety, and I freak out and I tell people things that I'm worried about, things that I shouldn't be. And other people can be sort of like maybe they need too much planning. Depends, like different people have different traits. You have to be able to accept and work with each other in a co-founding situation. There's no other way.
Thanks for sharing that. Today, my last question is about feedback from users, because it's very important for early stage startups, right? I know that often the user feedback will shape your product roadmap and will shape how you build your product in the future. So do you have any example to share with us, like how the feedback you receive from your user kind of changed or polished the direction your product is going towards?
So this is very important for us. Like before we even start Infrared as an MVP, like really 4 years ago or 5 years ago when we were at AIT, we did surveys. We actually went out on LinkedIn. We asked people or other sort of like platforms, and we asked people to give us their opinions on what they care about, which software they want us to integrate in, which sort of like feature they want us to develop. And we've been doing that consistently. We do that now. We're now actually conducting users interviews at this very moment to shape the solution. We are driven by the community.
Thank you so much, Angelos. This has been such a thoughtful and very insightful conversation with you today.